But otherwise, we find that some of the experts on the lines also try to respond to that. So I hope you'll be okay with that.
Of course.
And I think to start with today, we will request that you share your personal experiences in public health, because we get a lot of young scientists joining and we would like them to learn from our experts.
Okay, more than happy to do that.
Yeah, so just one disclaimer that Fred and I are not experts in this specific subject. So please bear with us when we ask stupid questions in our opinion. And please help us to ask the questions better. Feel free to do so.
No such thing as a stupid question.
So Sheila, Teun and Chris, just for your information, we're letting in everybody else onto the call right now. Is that okay?
Of course, yeah.
That's okay.
Yeah.
Oh, brilliant. Sheila, you can continue with the conversation. I just want to bring people in for...
Yeah. So any other questions?
So Sheila, you monitor the chat, do you?
Yes.
Okay,
we
good.
will monitor the chat, and some questions, if you have time, you will probably answer, but some that we feel are really relevant, we will raise them back to you and Teun to respond to. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. So please feel welcomed, relax, and we hope that you enjoy yourselves.
Thank you.
As we always do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think what we're going to do today is, before we actually start, if someone has come online whom you know, you might want to say hello. So before we mute everybody, please welcome, and feel free to have some informal or formal conversations by video or no video for the next 1 minute or two, and then we will begin the conversation.
Just looking at the list, it's a long list. It's very nice you organized this. I see Patricia Graves is one of the people. Super nice that you're joining.
Hi.
Patricia is the one expert we have,
Yeah.
and we're very unlucky with, but I think Patricia is going to come around. We're going to have a masterclass at some point, I hope. We did have a class with some of with the people in the past who have constantly suggested that we bring Patricia in, but I think she's been super busy, so I'm still very hopeful.
It's great to be here, thanks.
Yeah, Patricia did a lot of the early work on that we have tried to replicate, so she may have all the answers.
Ancient history now, ancient history.
Yeah, and yeah, lots of other things. Hello, Indra. I can see you. You're on page 5.
Page 5.
Yeah, of my attendees. Yeah, it's great. I mean, just a big shout out to you, Fredros and Sheila, for organizing this thing. It's fantastic. I've dipped into a couple and it's great. I really like the format. And, you know, I think that one thing we should all like doing is talking about what we do. I think conversation and communication is so important too. And people who do know me know that I do like to talk. So thanks for the opportunity.
And you're absolutely right. I mean, we try to make these masterclasses really about technical discourse and scientific discourse. We try to be as apolitical as possible. I don't know if that's correct English.
Yes.
We try to focus on the science as much as possible, because somehow we figured out that this has been missing lately. And yet it's important that people spend some, I mean, even if you go to conferences, typically, you know, a scientist has 15 minutes to talk, and and 3 minutes for questions. So these masterclasses are designed really for very open, long form. We have 2.5 hours, but if you want to go to 3 hours, why not?
No, but I think it is actually nice that even in the pre-COVID time, this didn't exist, right? I think you invented something that is, I hope, will stay also after we can all travel, because I think this is it's really exciting. I see at least 10 countries among the participants. There must be many more, so it's really really good.
Yeah, hello everyone. So thank you, Fredros, for organizing this. I'm just getting this discussion to ask for the French-speaking country participants. So if possible for the next time to provide maybe translation services to also help them to attend and enjoy these very nice discussions. Thank you.
On peut parler un peu de français, mais pas tout complètement pour le scientifique content de la présentation. Mais la prochaine fois en français et aussi Kiswahili.
Très, très bien.
So Mark, do we say, so when you want to say you're welcome in French, do you say, how do you say
Yeah,
it?
in French, we say
Bienvenue.
Bienvenue.
Ah,
Bienvenue à tous.
Yeah, bienvenue, Mark, and all the French
Merci,
speakers.
Sheila.
Sheila, can you confirm that our slides are showing?
Yes, yes, Fred. We can see the slides.
I hope it's not too late for people in. I see we have a couple of my friends from Malaysia. I see Benny O'Brien and I see Jeffrey here. I don't know where you are because you're always somewhere. And Chin Cheng, are you? Is it late night? There's nothing on the television in Australia.
They didn't have the cricket today. They only have one match at 10 o'clock.
Yeah, Indra, that's right. I hope we finish in time for the cricket, Fredros.
So Sheila, Fredros, you will start, right?
Yes, we will start soon, Fred. Fred, are you there?
Very, very good morning, everybody. Just so you know, this session is being streamed live on our YouTube channel. And as always, I will request my Ifakara colleagues to kindly share the link on the chat, just so everybody can have access to that for the future. We will be starting in approximately 1 minute. Turn up, Chris. As you can see, we have about 150 people already on the line. I have to say, though, I apologize because lately we've been facing a challenge sending out the notifications, but we hope that we will address this so that we can reach as many people as they would wish to join. But we are grateful for all our participants and thanks for their support over the many months. You might also want to know that this is the 33rd edition of these masterclasses. We were hoping to have 50 editions this year, 50 editions by December, 40 editions by December, but it's unlikely that we will, and probably we will not have classes a lot in November because we have ASTMH and then a few other meetings, and we would like to let people choose to have the freedom to attend those other meetings as well. But we will let you know. The next masterclass will be delivered by Professor Sir Nicholas White, and that is going to come tentatively on the 18th of November, but we will make the confirmations and let you guys know. My colleague Shayla and I are very, very happy that you've been able to join. So I guess, Shayla, we can get going. I don't know if you're happy.
Yes, let's start, Fred.
I think we have enough people on the line, and
yeah.
Our experts have been waiting for a while. So let's see how this is gonna go. John, do you guys have any questions for us now? It's finished. Chris?
No, I'm fine. I'm just sharing the link with a few people just in case they're interested. I'm hoping all my colleagues are working in the lab, but maybe they aren't.
That's nice. Oh, I just realized my camera isn't there. Hey, John, before we start, what does your science have to do with James Bond?
Oh no, I thought for a day I could not talk about James Bond.
You can't escape this.
No, so perhaps you should share the link. It was one of these things. I think in science we often, sometimes we complain about the pressure to publish, but some publications are a lot of fun. Many of them are actually, but this was a PhD candidate of mine who's a very big James Bond fan said, let's do a scientific project on James Bond. And our conclusion is that actually it's surprising he didn't die of infectious diseases because he's exposed to so many things and he really doesn't take any precautions. There's a lot funnier version of this story in the paper.
What's other than the fact that he didn't die of lessons? I know there's a hidden message there about travel.
There's a hidden message there about travel, but actually there's also, he's exposed, you will like this, Fred, to mosquitoes a few times. So one time he's inspecting his one-seat helicopter and there's a clear buzzing noise, but he ignores it. And it's probably 80s, but we all know that that's not without risk. So the hidden message in the story is that James Bond doesn't get much time to prepare for travel, but I think also many travelers, they do see travel as a nice bucket list and they just go to very exotic locations, but they don't think about all the health consequences that travel may involve. So that, I guess, is the hidden message. Enjoy reading it.
Yeah, I mean, I hope somebody shares the link on the chat box with the participants. And if you haven't read this new paper, it's published in Travel Medicine and Tropical Travel Medicine.
Medicine and infectious diseases. So it's
Travel Medicine and infectious diseases. Fantastic read. Do get some time to read that. Chris, the picture you see here is not the moon. A colleague of mine shared this from Bagamoyo, from Rufiji. What do you see?
I see perhaps the most beautiful stage of parasites that there is, really. I see some lovely gametocytes in there. It could be done with a little bit higher magnification, but I can see gametocytes is what I can see, Fredros.
Yes, I mean, our conversation today will dwell a lot on gametocytes. This picture was shared to me by Yeromin Mlacha, who I believe is on the line. I hope so. And it's from Rufiji.
Wow.
He didn't give me any metadata, but he said that this guy is not sick.
Yeah.
Or was not sick. So, not sick at all. So.
Well, and the thing that you see there, Fredros, is, I mean, again, I suspect quite a lot of people are accustomed to looking at malaria slides. You rarely see that many gametocytes in a blood film. You know, they're rare when they're there. You know, they're much lower densities. That person, you know, he says off the top of his head, but you know, they're looking like, you know, 2,000 gametocytes per microliter or something, which. Then the whole point is not sick, but probably infectious to mosquitoes, right? And
that's the point of our conversation today.
Yeah.
Infected but not sick. My colleague Jerry Killeen likes to say there's no such thing as asymptomatic malaria. We just don't know what's happening.
Yeah.
But is that accurate?
Well, there is, I mean, by a true definition, there is an asymptomatic malaria. I think that what we tend to do is just focus on our single time point encounters. So when I meet you, Fredros, you may not be sick, right? You may be parasitemic, but not sick. But I don't know what you were like a week ago, and I don't know what you'll be like a week in the future. And I think part of the problem is we're very keen on taking these snapshots or these encounters we have with individuals at, say, a health facility, and the little appreciation that malaria is, to all intents, you know, it can be a chronic infection, or it certainly persists for several weeks, often months, and yet we're making an opinion based on that single time point encounter.
Yeah.
And at the same time, we have also been doing some longitudinal studies, including one observation in Uganda, where a child was really infected with the same parasite clones for 3 years and had very good access to the clinic. Temperature was measured every 4 weeks, so no obvious signs of symptoms, no anemia, and this child just carried parasites for forever. I think this person is still parasite positive. But we think it's a question: is this asymptomatic? At least it's sufficiently low in symptomatology to not elicit any treatment-seeking behavior, even if it's very good. So I think there may be true asymptomatic infections, but I agree with Jerry and also that many of the infections we are a little bit lazy in looking at symptoms. We just use a thermometer and ask for fever. But if you look at inflammation or some other health effects, there may be something there. I would like to. It's super relaxed, so we can talk at length about everything we want. This picture actually makes me think. So this very high gametocyte density, you see it, but it's so rare. I think in my career, I must have come across like a dozen of these super high infected individuals, super high gametocyte carriers, but very few. But I don't know how few. So it would be really nice to actually better examine how many of these ultra high density gametocyte carriers, like 1,000 per microliter or more, who we know can actually infect close to 100% of the mosquitoes. How many are there? Because perhaps these people are very rare, but super important. And that's something would be really nice to.
And today we will have a long conversation about this and also the subject of non-random biting, which when overlaid with the subject you're talking about, creates a very, an even crazier picture. But Yeromin, if you have any information about this, and you might want to get in touch with Teun and Chris, because I think this might be very interesting to them. Sorry, guys, about before I send this back to Sheila. Sheila, I'm sorry for diverting the whole thing. We have seen some literature that suggests that if you don't treat malaria, you can have these parasites for as long as 200 days.
So longer. I would say.
Longer.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
okay. Yeah, it was just really interesting preparing for the masterclass. But anyway, sorry guys that we diverted this attention. I'm going to send this back to Shayla. Shayla, please.
Yeah, Fred. So perhaps to start us off, baby Chris and Teun, how did you get yourselves in public health? Please share with us what the journey has been like and the motivation to really work on malaria. We can start with you, Chris.
I'm just a bit older than Teun, so maybe that's fair. So I can kind of point to two sort of pivotal things in my career that made me go to public health. So I'm a biologist. That's what I studied. That's what I'm really interested in biology. And I remember in one undergraduate course, I took parasitology as a module, and there was a husband and wife team who were my lecturers, and we had one class practical where, apologies if anybody's squeamish, but we killed a rat and we pulled a tapeworm from its stomach. And this tapeworm went from one side of the class to the other and then back again. And I thought, that is amazing. How on earth does that work? So that was parasitology. That's really then what I wanted to do. And then I got an opportunity, and I think life is about opportunities and taking those opportunities and trying to maximize. I had, as part of my degree, I only ever really wanted to work in a laboratory. I had no, sort of real sort of major career designs. I was given the opportunity to do some work in a laboratory, and luckily that was in the Gambia. And so I've seen a couple of people on from the MRC, the Gambia, and Teun and I still have a project in the Gambia, and I am so lucky that I'm going there again on Monday. I ended up going to the Gambia and actually working on schistosomiasis in my first job. But I had to stay and read some microscope slides, and again, a very unfortunate story that a child came to the clinic there when they were running clinics. I measured the hematocrit, and this child had an hematocrit of 11%. So the hematocrit, for many of us on the call, will be between 30 and 40%. We're largely, hopefully, healthy. This child had 11% and actually died while they were waiting for their result. And I just thought, I've got to try and do something about this. I'm too squeamish to be a medic, but I just really wanted then to, really work in sort of public health, but trying to work at the forefront of that. And then I naturally fell into sort of transmission biology, in the sense malaria transmission biology, because I felt it was the confluence of all the stages, the human, the mosquito, and the parasite. And trying to understand that biological interaction really is what has driven me to do what I do today.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. What about you, Teun?
Yeah, so for me, I think there's some similar stories. There's also a slightly different angle. I'm a son of a pastor, so I was taught early in life I had to do something that's useful. But then it doesn't narrow it down, because there's so many useful things to do. But I did explore different things, including journalism or medical school. In the end, I did an internship in the Gambia. That was my first experience as a 20-year-old student. Super naive, but I thought this is where the real problems lie. And then after that, I got offered some positions as a PhD student in Nijmegen, working on, say, urological cancers, which is also important, but I just felt it wasn't for me. So I turned down all the job offers, spent a year in Ghana to think about what I'm going to do with at least the coming 10, 20 years of my life. And then I came back and I didn't have any funding. But I convinced Robert Sauerwijn, who's now retired, but was an important parasitologist in the Netherlands, still is. And he gave me the opportunity to work as a volunteer. So he didn't give me any money, but he allowed me to work in the lab. And that slowly allowed me to apply for funds. And then I did my PhD in Kenya. And there I really realized what infectious diseases mean. HIV was super prevalent in the area where I was working. Like 40% of all the pregnant women was HIV positive. And I wrote my thesis, but then the child who's on the front of my thesis actually later died of malaria. So it really, for me, it was really important experience to really know that we can be fascinated by the biology, and I think we should, and that's a really good motivation. But at the same time, it's such a huge problem. So that motivated me to continue. And then I met Chris somewhere in 2004 in Tanzania. And then actually we've been working together ever since. I don't want to calculate how long that is, because it makes me feel very old. But I've been lucky to just, after that bumpy start and not having funding, to be able to create some kind of research niche and really have a really fascinating job in malaria.
Yeah, thanks, Teun. We can talk about the tips for, you know, long-lasting partnerships later.
Yeah, you guys seem to have worked together forever. It's difficult to find a publication where the two of you don't appear together. And Teun, actually, I have to say that when I wrote my first grant, one of your friends, Professor William Taken, gave me a draft copy of your application. This was a Grand Challenges Exploration. You were a winner on the very first round of this. And William shared with me a copy of what I believe was your application.
Quite possible.
He shouldn't have. What?
No, it's absolutely fine. He did it. I didn't know.
Yeah, this we can declassify this information 10 years later or 15 years later.
Fred, and what you don't know, Fred, is that we were given your publication draft when we were applying for our GCC, and a number of us actually, and we actually got it.
Oh, okay. Who's?
Yours, Fred. Yours.
Oh, me. I was given tons.
Fantastic.
And I studied this thing so many times, my friend. So luckily, I got my first application went successful. I don't know. I think it's because of all these things coming into conference. But really, just to say thank you guys so much, both Chris and Teun, for that. Sheila, back to you.
Yes, thank you, Fred. So just as a reminder, today we are going to talk about the implications of asymptomatic malaria infections. And we are going to really take a deep dive and discuss how this influence the choices that we make for malaria control as well as elimination. And then we are going to also look at how malaria infections change by age, what we refer to when we say immunity, what really determines immunity, and how asymptomatic malaria really changes between, the shifts between symptomatic and asymptomatic malaria, and whether we should be focusing on school-going children now that we have tests that can determine infections throughout all the ages that we have, all the cases that we have. And then we also look at malaria hotspots as well as the reservoirs for malaria infections, really looking at both epidemiological and entomological indicators and how those influence malaria transmission and how to measure them and what the challenges are around that in both control and elimination settings. And then we will look at, of course, how to detect malaria parasites, how to determine what is asymptomatic, what the challenges are there when we are thinking about malaria programs, as well as opportunities, especially in eliminating countries. We'll also look at not just falciparum, but Plasmodium knowlesi as well as vivax, because we acknowledge that there are differences there as well, and something to learn there as well. So welcome to everyone, and we hope to have an interesting and knowledgeable masterclass today. Back to you, Fred.
Back to you, Sheila.
Okay, yeah. So I'll start with you, Teun. Before we really get into the meat of things, we would like to understand the definitions. As we were going through the publications with Fred, I kept asking Fred what these definitions really mean, and we decided we'll just start off with this first. So what do we mean by subpattern, submicroscopic, asymptomatic? Really the definitions of this as we go.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked this, Sheila, because there are sometimes there's confusing literature. So, and a lot of things actually will not be much clearer after this talk, because I think a lot of things like subpatent and submicroscopic, of course, it depends on the quality of your microscopy, for instance. Asymptomatic is very important. Asymptomatic can be microscopically detected, and it can also be microscopically undetected, so submicroscopic. So asymptomatic doesn't say anything about the parasite density per se, and sometimes they are mistaken. They're used interchangeably, but they're really different things. So that asymptomatic, we discussed before, and we'll discuss more. Asymptomatic is often just defined as not having symptoms at the moment you detect the infection. I think that's a poor definition. We sometimes say asymptomatic, or we say not having symptoms sufficient to elicit treatment-seeking behavior. So these things are quite complicated. I think asymptomatic we should continue to challenge as a term. Microscopically detectable, I think, is relatively clear. Often we say anything 100 parasites per microliter or higher should be detectable by microscopy. But if you look at it carefully, and we have done it also with recently in a paper with Hannah Slater and Lucy O'Kell and others, if you look at the performance of microscopy across many different really good research settings, then you see a lot of variation. So you do sometimes have parasite densities by molecular methods that should be detectable by microscopy that still are not, and the other way around. And submicroscopic, we typically define as an infection that you can really detect, often by molecular methods, but it is not visible on a microscopy slide.
Can you say again, subpatent?
So subpatent, of course, it is, if you use microscopy as the diagnostic tool, it's the same as submicroscopic. It's below the patency level of the microscopy, but subpatent could also refer to other diagnostics in a way. Chris, would you agree?
Yeah, so that, I mean, for me, subpatent is whatever test you're using, so below the threshold of detection of RDT or microscopy. And just Teun makes a really important point that I think, and it gets back to Sheila, sort of the idea of how we translate what we do to control. When we talk about submicroscopic, we're very often talking about microscopy in a research setting. Again, many of you will have experience of working in a health facility, or at least working with health facilities, and know that in some places a microscopist in that health facility has a load of sick people outside. They're reading 30, 40 slides a day. They may not necessarily have the time to read that slide with the level of, to give us the same sensitivity as we would in a research setting. And I think that's a challenge, because quite a lot of our findings now are saying, actually, we could detect some of these infectious individuals by microscopy, but then it depends on the quality of microscopy that we're going to, impose on that. So I'm thinking that the submicroscopic here is typically at a research level rather than a health facility public health screening sort of level, where, if I've done it, if I see one parasite on a slide, I can stop reading that slide and then pass it on and say whoever the clinical officer needs to treat this person because they're malaria positive. I don't do a deep dive in that, and I would never probably read 100 fields of that slide to say it's negative. I think that there's a level of consistency around the approach. Sorry, that was slightly long-winded, but there you go.
Yeah, no, but it's really nice that you guys clarify this. You will notice during the masterclass that Sheila and myself might use these words interchangeably, so forgive us for that.
Okay.
But it's nice that you guys have made this clarification, because they kind of appear many times to do that. Sheila, shall we proceed, or you have additional questions?
Yeah, let's proceed.
Cool. So Chris, actually, before we go there, this slide has two blood slides, a thick and a thin one. Could you just explain very briefly why you do thick and thin?
Yeah, so it is actually.
Sorry for the basic questions.
No, it's a really good question actually, because at least in my experience, we use thick and thin. So thick gives you, obviously, because there are many more red cells, layers of red cells in a thick film, and it increases your sensitivity for screening parasites. And I've got the chat going up on the side here. I've seen a couple of comments around non-falciparum species. My feeling and my experience is that you would tend to use a thin film, potentially for more accurate enumeration of very high density parasitemias, or to try and really differentiate non-falciparum species, because sometimes they are not particularly obvious. It's not so easy to see either Schuffner's dots in Vivax, or the other James's dots in Ovale, or the daisy type effect of in Schizonts in Malaria. These things you do need. It's better to have a really nice image if you can get that from a thin film.
Okay, thank you so much. Let's proceed, and would like to start with you again, Chris. We're going to start today with a very high level summary. Some kind of, let's start with the end in mind, right? So if someone were to read your publications from early 2000s to now, we were hoping that by the time we are in 2021, we have a clear answer to these questions. And we've looked quite a bit. I think the general observation feeling now is that yes, these submicroscopic infections do contribute significantly to transmission, and that they are important for targeting during elimination. But we would like you guys to begin just by providing an overview of the extent of the problem based on these 4 questions. Again, you don't have to answer them all, but just very roughly, how big is this problem? How important is it to transmission? We see some differences between West Africa and East Africa, for example. I don't know if this is permanent, but it's up. Feel free to talk about this very generally before we proceed.
Yeah, thanks again. We have, as you say, been looking at this for quite a long time, and we haven't provided a definitive answer. And I think it's because, and I think hopefully we're going to talk about all the different becauses. But the extent of the problem is, as Teun mentioned, our sort of collaboration with Imperial College, which has been fantastic. And I think first back in 2007, we showed a graph plotting microscopy against PCR level infection. So anybody PCR is what we would class as submicroscopic in that context, and probably asymptomatic. And basically the observation was that there were overall about 50% more infections when you looked by PCR. Our subsequent iterations, and essentially many people, since then have added other studies where they've used comparing PCR and RDTs and comparing PCRs and microscopy. The relationship actually has not changed so much, that there is still about, still get 50% more infections when you look by microscopy. But what we've now been able to do is to try and look, as you said, but more geographically where this relationship differs or is the same, and almost by age. And so broadly speaking, we see that there are more submicroscopic or PCR level infections in older individuals who have immunity that allows them to keep those infections at a lower level, and that those infections are more prevalent in areas of higher transmission intensity, again, presumably related to immunity. Having said that, we still describe low-level infections in individuals in areas where there's relatively little transmission, which kind of challenges the dogma of, do you always get sick with your first malaria infection, to a degree, because presumably there is, it could be innate immunity, either genetics, host genetics, perhaps these are all sickle cell or G6PD or thalassemic, or there's other factors that limit that parasite growth in that person, or that perhaps there are within falciparum parasites that don't automatically multiply to become hugely sort of, to give the high parasite densities that we would see by microscopy. Maybe I'll stop there and let Teun chip in if he wants to on that, the scale of the asymptomatics and submicroscopics.
Yeah, well, I think that you described the scale quite well, that it's overall it's 50% of the infections is not detected, but in low endemic settings it could be 80% or more that is not detected by microscopy, and that is counterintuitive in a way that you would expect less immunity there, but it also has to do with older infections. So if you get infection after infection, then the average age of your infection will be quite short. And often the infections start with high density and then they decline. So I think one really good explanation, I'm sure it's a very important contributor to many submicroscopic infections in low endemic settings, is that these infections last so long and they have reduced densities quite quickly. Now, the importance on whether they're targeted, I think I agree, it's embarrassing we don't know. I think for the asymptomatics in Africa, I think there is broad consensus that they should be targeted. So all the studies that I know of, and quite a few of them we've performed ourselves, they estimate that more than 95% of all the mosquito infections are from asymptomatic individuals. That includes microscopy positive individuals and microscopy negative submicroscopic infections. And to really say what's the contribution of this submicroscopic proportion, or this proportion of people who have submicroscopic infections, that really differs by setting. So we've seen some estimate of 10 to 15% of all the mosquitoes that become infected in feeding assays are because of submicroscopic infections. Sometimes you see higher. I know at least one of them had 30%, one of them even higher, but I'm not sure whether I think that was completely done to the standards we have nowadays.
Oh, thank you. Thank you guys so much. Go ahead.
Yeah, you said something there that malaria infections start high and then decrease.
Yeah.
Explain that. I thought it would be opposite.
So they start, well, of course, they start low initially, but then within a few days or weeks, the parasite densities go up. And then if you think of an infection that really lasts long, it's like 200 days, or so we had one child with at least over 1,000 days of the same clone, then it fluctuates, but the general trend is that it goes down until perhaps there's a new clone coming in, and then it may rise again. And that's the pattern that you see in high endemic settings. Also, these parasite densities, they may be declining, but then you have a super infection, a new infection, it goes up again. So the chance of it having a density that is high enough to be detected is quite large. But then if you have one infection and you don't get treated, and if you still have the infection 3 months later, it's very likely that it's of a very low density because somehow you've been able to control that parasite density. And that's also what you see in neurosyphilis patients who, of course, were treated with malaria in the 1930s, and they still provide some of the most beautiful, clean data, probably not real life as we know it in Africa or Asia or South America. But there you also see that some people have infections for a year, but it goes down.
Yeah, interesting. So the malaria world is so complex, and this is depicted by the picture we see in front of us, that we can actually just see the head of the hippo. The rest of it we can't really see and can't determine how big or how large. So this sort of applies to malaria. What is happening here? We can only see what we can test, but we can't see what is left. What can we do to ensure that we are getting everything? We are measuring and testing everything. Is it possible?
Do we need to? I would like to.
We need to.
I think that's the big challenge. So I think in some ways, and this is the epidemiologist speaking, but you would expect some kind of, if we plot parasite densities on a log scale, you would expect some kind of distribution where you see the tail, and sometimes you see distributions that you see, I'm missing part of the tail. If you imagine a normal distribution, for instance, and you see it sort of chopped off, then you have a real feeling that we're missing very low density infections. But I think with some very sensitive assays, and sometimes it involves taking a milliliter of blood, or sometimes it involves RNA targets to really boost your sensitivity. Sometimes you get this distribution that you think we probably captured nearly all of the infections. We may have missed some, but probably 99% of the infections we have captured. And then the real question is how much, and I think that's a big question, it's probably the biggest question that we raised, is how much do you actually have to invest in finding these last parasites to get to elimination? Because there will be some densities that probably are irrelevant.
Yeah. Yeah, and they're irrelevant because they're either those infections are too old and they're actually disappearing on their own, or that they were never going to infect a mosquito. I think the other thing, which so you could have either chosen the hippo or the iceberg, I think, which is a very common sort of other way of, you know, demonstrating global warming. Sadly,
we like the hippo because
I prefer the hippo. But too many.
There's no ice in Africa, you know.
There were a little bit on Sheila's picture behind on Kilimanjaro, but not enough. I think that the thing about it is what neither that or the iceberg capture is that the amount that is beneath the water here will change with season, and it will change actually spatially. So, you know, that difference, it's not the same in Kenya or Tanzania, looking at you, Sheila, or Fredros, you know, that in certain parts that there's a difference. And it's trying to understand that dynamic, because potentially understanding that dynamic, if that you know, the bit under the water becomes really skinny, then at certain times of the year, then maybe you have a seasonal opportunity to attack it when that reservoir is at its smallest. So one might think of delivering, you know, we get onto interventions in a minute, but you know, something like a seasonal MDA. And I think that, you know, targeting that, you know, just before the transmission season starts, when we expect really few people to be infected, may be an opportunity to do that. So I think that's kind of what we're seeing. Understanding the expansion and, you know, the limits of that within a population are really important.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. There's a question from Joe. When we speak about higher and lower parasite densities, do the densities of asexual and sexual stages change in parallel? Do lower densities of asexual stages correlate with lower densities of gametocyte?
So for Plasmodium vivax, they correlate extremely well. So you can almost say like 10% of your total parasite mass is gametocyte. So for Plasmodium vivax, although there is some benefit in measuring gametocytes, if you want to predict who infects how many mosquitoes, my gut feeling is that probably a total parasite density estimate is good enough. And then we know, we'll come to that later, I'm sure, but that below, say, 10 gametocytes per microliter, the likelihood of infecting mosquitoes becomes quite small. For Plasmodium falciparum, it's more complicated. It's largely because of the biology. It just takes 10, 12 days from asexual parasites to become gametocyte. But now we know more about gametocyte commitment. There also appears to be quite a lot of variation in gametocyte commitment between infections. So some infections actually produce a lot of gametocytes for a given density, and others very little. So for Plasmodium falciparum, there is a broad trend. Of course, asexual parasites in asymptomatic infections are associated with gametocytes, but it's not very clear cut. And one thing that's really important is that often we find that the clinical cases with like 20,000 parasites per microliter or more, they actually have comparatively few gametocytes. So you would say these are the most important transmitters, but depending on how long it takes to go to the clinic, actually you may have a lot of parasites, but you have not yet developed gametocytes. So that is really important to keep in mind. It's not the highest density infections overall, although among asymptomatic infections, the higher density asymptomatic infections often have also the higher density gametocytes.
Thank you guys.
Yeah, interesting.
Wonderful. And just to assure you, we are going to talk about the effect of treatment on these densities and what happens if you don't treat them. we've seen you guys have done some work on that.
Mm-hmm.
And the second thing you mentioned, I've forgotten, but we're going to talk about this as well. Sheila, do you want to proceed? Or? Thanks also
since you're talking about
to Dr. Wagman for the questions.
Yeah, since you're talking about gametocytes, so Teun and Chris, have we answered all these questions, or are there some that are left? For example, what triggers gametogenesis in P. falciparum?
At least it's in part it's stochastic. So we have seen also in controlled infections, and also others have seen that there is a proportion of parasites that will always commit to gametocytes.
They have to for their biology. I mean,
they have to.
So there's always something there. So you would rarely get an infection. I mean, I think we all may have encountered laboratory isolates that never produce gametocytes, but in a human, you would expect nearly every parasite infection to make gametocytes, or else how is it going to get out and perpetuate itself?
But then still, what makes a high gametocyte producer is there's still some uncertainties. We recently did a study with colleagues in Burkina Faso, where we saw that gametocyte commitment actually changes during an infection. So very early in an infection, there's more investment in asexual multiplication, it seems, but then quite soon after, there starts to the commitment to gametocytes increases. So that commitment to gametocytes, so what triggers gametocytogenesis is probably not stable during an infection. So that's already a complicating factor. And one of the things that now we have good molecular markers for gametocyte commitment, we have to readdress, and we're doing that also in some of the studies that we jointly do, is what's the effect of anemia, for instance, or superinfection, or different hemoglobinopathies on gametocyte commitment. So I think only in the last 5 years or so, we really started to develop these tools for gametocyte commitment. And I think that really allows us to answer that question definitively. So I think what triggers gametocytogenesis is not yet answered, but we're getting there.
I think that's right. So part of the reason these are still questions is that we haven't had the tools to, or the experimental design to be able to answer some of the questions. One of the things, and this will please Fredros and Sheila, is that, you know, there is some from the classic literature, some suggestion that mosquito bites may trigger some increase in commitment to gametocytogenesis. And that is something that we're trying to investigate at the moment, whether, you know, actually being bitten will increase the prevalence of gametocytes in the population.
And one thing I think we did answer is one of the later points: do gametocytes preferentially localize in the small capillaries? So this was circulating for so long as a hypothesis that together we did one study, and then there were some good colleagues doing a similar study actually at the same time, where we quantified gametocytes in the mosquito blood meal and then compared gametocytes that fed on venous blood and mosquitoes that fed on venous blood versus mosquitoes that fed on the skin. And then we hypothesized, if there's really sequestration, these gametocytes have to be present in higher quantities in the blood meals of mosquitoes that fed on the skin rather than on the vein. But we, and also these colleagues from Mali and from Oxford, found no difference. So I think I can be convinced otherwise, but I think so far I strongly believe there's no sequestration of gametocytes in the small capillaries in the skin.
But you know what, Teun, you know, sorry, Sheila, for interrupting you. I used to work with the French Cameroonian friend of ours, Louis Guanya. You guys know him? Yeah. And Louis was doing a study on malaria competence, and they could go around schools many times trying to find a gametocyte positive child. It was very rare. They rarely got one. One question we discussed earlier today, and I suspect that we might have asked you this question sometime in one of our meetings, is how come it is so difficult to find these gametocyte positives in the peripheral blood, and yet even in very low transmission settings, mosquitoes seem to know where to find them. So I mean, you could have only 2 people infected, but somehow mosquitoes know how to find these people. How does this actually happen? Does the question even make sense?
Yes, it
makes
does.
a lot of sense, yeah.
Makes a lot
Chris,
of
do you
sense.
want to start?
Well, I can try and explain what I think we know is that I think that, again, Fredros, we're so human-centric in the way we think about this. When we look, we don't think it's possible. But if you thought about a mosquito, and you know much more about them than I do, you potentially, a mosquito is going to probe the same person many times, potentially probe a number of individuals. How much more sampling does a mosquito have of that human population than we do? With our very often single time point encounters, knowing that, I noticed one of the questions there is about the circadian patterns for gametocytes. It's not something that I think, it's certainly not been definitively shown for falciparum. There's strong indications, certainly for the primate malarias and many of the other malarias, that there is some sort of circadian. But if you just think that the mosquito samples so many more times, and there are so many more mosquitoes than people, I think it's a bit of a numbers game, which is probably not a very specific explanation, but that's what I think it is down to.
Yeah, and I think in addition, Louis Guanya, who's actually the person who taught me how to dissect in Kenya.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so it's a very small world. Now it's a big world, but with a few people who know a lot of people. But he was looking for the microscopy positive gametocyte carriers, and those are very rare. But I think we have shown that we are not very good at finding gametocytes, beautiful and clear as they are on the slide. We're just not very good at finding them, and mosquitoes are better. But that doesn't mean they have to sequester in the skin. And we, across our studies, we often find that 5% of the population can infect mosquitoes, sometimes 10, sometimes 15% of the general population. So it is not that it's impossible to find people who infect mosquitoes. And I think that comes back to that picture you showed. I am still super curious to know how important are potential super spreaders. So if one in 1,000 people walks around with 1,000 gametocytes per microliter, how likely are you to capture that one individual, to have that person in your survey? But this person may be responsible for 5% of all infected mosquitoes, or even more in a village. So I really believe that you may have these super spreaders. Yeah,
and I think that where our work is taking us now is to this concept of like an area under a curve. If you think about, it's not just that you have gametocytes, it's how long do you have them for, and therefore then you think about the mosquito sampling. We will come on to school kids, but if you think that there might be, you have to be in the right place to be sampled, and you have to be available to be sampled. So it could be a small child, but a small child under a mosquito net is not available to be sampled. We all know, well, some of us have got kids who are not in that 5-year-old bracket, and they're far less easy to control in what they do and where they sleep, and those are going to be more potentially available. And I think so. It is a combination of, it's really understanding not just that single time point, but that longevity of both the infection, the gametocyte fraction of that infection, and the availability to mosquitoes.
Thank you guys so much. We're going to move forward because of time. Shella, go ahead.
Yeah, just one more, Chris. Who is a super spreader? What is the definition of a super spreader?
Well, sadly, in these times of COVID, this sort of thing is becoming more common knowledge, I think. So this is a person who, at least in the context of COVID, has an infection and infects many more others, compared to other people who may have the infection and only infect one or two. So it's a bit like the concept of R0, the second number of secondary infections that rise from an infection in malaria. What we typically present as is an average of that, but there are obviously bounds to that, or variation within that. And an individual, again, we go back to that slide that you first presented, as Teun said, that person, if they are bitten repeatedly, they could infect nearly all the mosquitoes that bite on them, and therefore those mosquitoes are responsible, and they've all arisen from that same feeding on that person while they were infected. So that person would be a super spreader.
Right, so it's related to the density, the parasite density.
Yeah, and the duration for which they have that. So that part of the reason we talk about acute and chronic. So if you have high densities, you will hopefully go to a clinic and you will get treated. The duration of your infection is therefore much shorter than an asymptomatic infection, which can last for, as we've already said, hundreds of days. And even if you're low density, you could get bitten and infect maybe 20 mosquitoes over that time period, but it would still be more than that person who was treated.
We did get, we do have at least one slide with this area under curve infectiousness. So maybe at that time we can explain it a little more. And it's really just nice that finally we are able to talk about these things in a little bit more detail. Lots of questions remaining to be answered. Just a quick note to our colleagues on the chat. We notice you're sending quite very good questions. One reason that they're not being elevated yet is because for some of them we believe that we have slides aligned. So let's just wait a little bit and then, but keep sharing the questions. And if there are experts in the chat who are willing to already address the questions, this applies also to both Teun and Chris. Feel free to do this as well. And Teun, it's nice to bring back the memories from Louis Guanya. We knew him mostly for his good footballing skills, excellent drawing, and fantastic dancing, Cameroonian dancing style. For those days there was Dombolo and stuff. But also a great malaria scientist. So fantastic. Sheila, back to you, please.
Yeah, thank you, Fred. So we've been talking a lot about symptomatic, parasite density, and we started off with a slide, a picture of microscopic slide. So for a long time, Teun, we had microscopes. I mean, we were dependent on microscopy for detecting malaria parasites and infections. But then now we have RDTs. And most of the areas of malaria programs actually use RDTs. How has this changed the way we tackle malaria, testing of malaria and malaria transmission?
It's nice I get this question because, Fred, do you see we do publish this separate from each other? I'm not in the paper. But
So you were
clearly,
born
this was a meeting report, and I think you were still a student, so you're not invited.
Quite possible. No, but it has changed, and I think it's at least 75%, probably more, of the diagnoses are by RDT and not by microscopy anymore. Initially, we thought, and we've also done some small studies on it, do people actually like RDTs? Do they trust it as much? Do they not give treatment if the RDT is negative? So that was an initial concern. I think that people may say it's not perfect in sensitivity. We may still treat people even if their RDT is negative. But I think it's really been, it has become the standard, but with one really big concern. Well, there's two big concerns probably. One of them is that these RDTs, of course, can stay positive quite long after you are you've had malaria and your parasites have cleared. So in our studies in Burkina Faso, for instance, where people really get a lot of infections, if people have had treatment in the last month and then they are RDT positive, we still want to check whether they are actually parasite positive by microscopy or whether it's antigen persistence in the blood that results in a false positive RDT. And the other big question, of course, is HRP2 deletions. And I am shocked by some of the findings also from Ethiopia, where you really see 40% or more of the parasites lack HRP2. So that means we have to really reconsider what RDTs we're going to use. I think it really improved healthcare a lot, and I think it's a really important element to better diagnosis and treatment. But there is this big concern on the cheap, sensitive HRP2 based RDTs are not good in all settings.
Yeah, and if I can add to that, I think that again the RDTs have been fantastic, and I think they've improved diagnostic and access to diagnostics. So, you know, I've worked in places in Tanzania where there was no diagnostic before. There was a small hut and it was solely symptomatology. Now having a simple RDT means that you can make an informed diagnosis. Yes, this person has a positive test. No, and you have it there. No, this fever is due to another cause. And that's really important. I think we have to remember they're really designed for use at the clinical interface, and that's where, you know, that's where they're. So it's a little bit about, you had it with your hippopotamus, you know, what proportion of the total sort of infected population will be attending that clinic? And I think it therefore depends, into Sheila, your question about how do they affect transmission. It depends how they're used and in what population you're screening, you know, for them to be used. We can see actually, you know, the highly sensitive rapid diagnostic test, which at least in my mind got off to a little bit of a sticky start, but I think they've improved now, some of the later iterations, as have all RDTs, they've improved over time. I think now we may be getting to a level where they could potentially be, you know, more useful at a population level.
You know, one of the things that come from these studies, and by the way, we should have said this earlier, these undetectable parasthemias were neglected for a very long time. And so for people going towards malaria elimination, and we will see this forward, it's really good news, if you like, or a big advantage for the malaria community or global health community, that at least a few people, primarily you guys, the two of you, have been studying this subject so aggressively. And because then this provides a basis for future work on elimination. So we just wanted to say thank you guys and congratulations, and really just honestly, thank you guys for paying attention to this subject, even in the times when it was, you know, nobody really wanted to pay attention to that. One of the issues that have come up is the validity of the RDTs in places where elimination is near. So, for example, what does a negative RDT mean in a place like Zanzibar? You know, we had this problem with slides in the past. We would say a negative slide does not exclude malaria. So, presumptive treatment, IMCI, or, you know, when I was growing up, you have fever, you will be treated for malaria whatsoever. You know, but now, what does a negative RDT mean in a place with very little malaria? What's the predictive value for this negative test? Can you guys comment on this? Because we see a little bit of a problem here.
Yeah, that is a good question, and there's no easy answer to it. But we have recently done a study in Uganda where we did a longitudinal study, and we captured infections quite early on, and then we looked at their detectability by microscopy, and probably RDT is at least not better than research microscopy. And we saw quite a number of incident infections, so people were really parasite-free, and then they became parasite positive, and there was still the first 4 weeks, 8 weeks, sometimes 12 weeks, they were submicroscopic. And then the parasite densities rose, and then some of these individuals became really important transmitters. So I think that is the other challenge, that in many communities surveys, you think we're either going to treat everyone now or we're going to test and treat them. But of course, these densities, they may be on the rise, and people may be irrelevant for transmission now, but they may become relevant later. That's not still the overall trend that parasite densities over time, they decline. That's still true, but there is this relevant phase where infections may be undetectable by RDT, by microscopy, and it's not days, it can be weeks in individuals with a certain level of immunity. I think in completely malaria naive individuals, the symptoms will arise very rapidly, but in individuals with partial immunity, you have a possibility of having really important RDT negative infections.
In the latest version of our plotting of PCR versus microscopy, that discordance was high in places where have gone from high to low transmission, or it was still quite pronounced there, which is a little bit like you have for Zanzibar, I'd suggest, Fredros, is, you know, okay, it's been low for a while, but you still have some Assay in that community who will have some immunity to malaria. And, you know, the other thing, and it came up a little bit in the chat, is just about the complexity of that. As infections as transmission drops, infections will by and large become less complex. And you may be more able to control a simple infection. So as that infection moves forward, and that may, add to that time to patency.
Yeah.
Of course.
So I mean, would we then argue that the role of genomics becomes more important in these settings? We had a masterclass with Diane Worth, and they were telling us about these clonal infections in Mali, where people tend to have the same clones. And I think we will, Shell and myself have at least one question for you guys related to that. So let's hold those thoughts. And Teun, you did mention Ethiopia. We have a question for that, so don't mind that we are not responding to that, but we do that. Very quickly, Chris, you worked a lot in Tanzania.
Ndio bwana. Yes.
Yes. Welcome back home. Habari ya siku nyingi. And in Tanzania, you worked a lot with Dr. Rayban and our colleagues. Our director is actually on the line, Dr. Nurati Masanja. So at some point, you guys can connect. Yes. But there's something that is very interesting from the studies you guys conducted here. And I would like us to focus on one question Michelle and myself discussed earlier of the natural history of malaria, of the untreated form of malaria. So you see this trend with age for normal infections, but when you're talking things like cerebral malaria, it kind of reverses. And you see this also with the lower transmission settings. So what is happening here? Is it true that you don't get cerebral malaria in kids, or you have only a few of them? What's happening here?
I mean, actually, it would be really helpful if there were other sort of experts on here. I have my kind of own sort of crude, more observational answer to this. Is that so? What we saw in that study, and again, I think there were parallel studies done actually a few years before in Kilifi, up the coast in Kenya, where this sort of age phenomena, the transmission being equal, young children under 3 tend to more commonly present with severe anemia. That's the principal manifestation of severe disease. And it's actually only those older children, 4 to 6, 4 to 8, that would present with cerebral manifestations. Of course, there's never any exclusivity in those sorts of definitions or compartments. And I think, I've heard various explanations for it about actually having to have some potential immunity before this thing before cerebral malaria manifests itself, it to be due to a particular strain or a particular binding type of cerebral malaria. But I don't have a clear and definitive answer for that. I just know that it's something we observed, that in that particular study where we'd used altitude as our proxy for transmission levels, and effectively on the page you're showing there, what we were looking at was log order differences in transmission intensity between the altitude. So roughly EIRs at the low altitude of 100, the medium altitude of 10, and then 1 or less at the highest altitude. So it's actually, if you like, a natural experiment to look at presentation in those studies. And we did see that difference. And also the fact that at the lower transmission, disease is spread across all age groups because that immunity level is so much different.
Excellent point. And I mean, someone just put on the chat here a question on resistance. And, recently I had a conversation with Manuel Hetzel from PH. And he asked me a question. I mean, they have put on medical archives, MEDREX, whatever you call it, preprints. They have put up a preprints about rectal artesunate and some of the failures that's happening there. And Manuel asked me, the malaria cases that end up being severe, do they all begin as uncomplicated malaria, or do you have a certain subpopulation that always becomes severe? We would like to translate this question directly to you guys by asking, how much do these long-term untreated asymptomatics contribute to severity?
Mm.
Do you guys have any information?
Well, I think, again, if you have to kind of zoom out and take a population look to it, I think there are so many more factors that potentially influence progression to severity. And I think, you know, some of those are socioeconomic and educational, in the sense that a parent or a caregiver may not understand the time, you know, that those symptoms appear initially, and a child doesn't get treatment quick enough. And I think that is probably one of the biggest issues in terms of, you know, progression to severity. Chronic infections per se, and whether they lead to it, Teun gave a very nice explanation before. What we've seen is that these infections can grumble on and not become severe, but actually if you get a super infection on top of that, that confuses your immune system, and together the new infection and the existing infection can rise to become a clinical infection. It's quite difficult to attribute that to a specific factor, except for
and that is age independent.
Yes, although you would say that at an older age, you are more likely, because you've just got less immunity to a broader set of variant or even conserved sort of immune markers. And I tell you, Fred Ross, where I first noticed that was in Ifakara, working with Tom Smith, who described essentially that actually people were similarly parasitized in the dry season or the low transmission season, and with limited clinical disease, but it was only in the kind of really wet season and the transmission season where prevalence was still the same, but the number of clinical cases went up, and it was attributed largely to new clones being introduced to their system, to their bodies.
Super infections or new, so that's not super infection, that's just a new clone.
That's a new clone. It's a super infection in the sense that it's an infection on top of an existing infection.
All right. Okay. Thanks. And dear colleagues on the line, forgive us for asking too many questions. And if you do have an answer for any of this, please feel free to chip this in. We're going to try and rush because of time, but not rush a lot, just a little bit. Some of this we'll just mention and challenge and go ahead. The two of you have supported the malaria eradication research agenda. This is there was a 2011 one and a 2017 one, addressed a number of knowledge gaps. We asked you guys a little question over there, and so I would like us to skip this now, given that you already addressed it in some of your comments. The other important thing is the correlation. So it would be nice if you could talk a little bit about this term, the correlation between PCR prevalence and the microscopy prevalence. I think you guys mentioned it a little bit in your conversation earlier, but it would be nice using this graph from your publication here. If you could just again highlight these correlations a little bit. Yeah.
If we look at the scatter plot on the right, then you see the line of the diagonal line. That's the line of perfect agreement. So if all the dots would be on that line, there would be perfect agreement between microscopy prevalence and PCR prevalence, because every dot, I should start with that, every dot is a study. So I don't know, I think we had 140 studies or so at some point, and later much more. So because all the dots are above the line, it means that PCR prevalence in almost all of these studies is higher than microscopy prevalence. And you see, it's not that the dots are away from the line. The distance from the line is the same for all transmission intensity. So in high endemic settings, so towards the right top corner, actually, many infections that are present are actually young infections and quite high density infections. So their microscopy actually performs quite well. But if you go to the left bottom corner, you see quite a few studies that have 0% parasites by microscopy, but then 10, sometimes 20% by PCR. And I think that's one of the thought-provoking findings from some of the work that Chris initiated and we later did together, that you have these malaria-free populations if you don't look hard enough. But if you look very hard, you see much more. And that's in the left panel. You see that the more you look by light microscopy or by DNA-based measures in in light blue or by RNA-based measures in gray. The harder you look, the more you find.
But not necessarily people whom you should treat. It's just that they have the infection.
Exactly. Yeah.
Sheila, please. Oh, okay.
Fred, can you take that one?
Okay. I guess the only quick question here, again, very quickly, we will come back to this, is we have had quite a bit of challenges studying these very low levels. Very broadly, what do you guys think is going to be some of the major advancements now that we have improvements on the genomic side? One thing that Teun, you mentioned a lot in this paper is the role that molecular surveillance is going to play. Can you explain a little bit more how this will improve our studies of the subpatent or symptomatic cases?
I think I think there's the one big question: how important are they for transmission? That also it depends on how you achieve low transmission. So in one of the settings we worked in, mosquito reductions in mosquito exposure by indoor residual spraying, by nets, was really reduced. And at some point, they stopped keeping those interventions up to the quality they had initially. And then having a large pool of parasites is really important. So I think in settings like those, where actually you think it goes well, but the parasites are still there, we just managed to control the mosquitoes. I think knowing submicroscopic infections and perhaps even knowing their complexity, so you have an idea of what's the force of infection in the population, is really important. I think in settings where transmission declined because houses improved, the wealth went up, the mosquitoes disappeared, just the entire area became wealthier, healthier, had better access to health, then I think the submicroscopics are much less important, just because it's a lot more, it's a complete package. So I think that's where I think the subtlety, but also the importance of the message lies.
Yeah, I think that, and we discussed it a little bit before, just kind of understanding that concept of super spreaders as well. Teun's group have been sort of pioneering this approach to try and not just molecularly type an infection, but to type the asexual and the sexual stage component of that, because some of the work that we did a while back showed that we typed both the infection in the mosquito and the infection in the person, and we found many more different clones in the mosquito than we did in the human. And we were initially quite surprised and perplexed by that, but that is essentially because the clones that were in the human that infected the mosquito were at very much lower density. So it's a technical explanation, but it means that if we want to sort of try disentangle this sort of super spreader thing, we might need to have a tool that allows us to differentiate between the asexual and sexual stage infection at a molecular level, and that would allow us a much more direct assessment of transmissibility from an individual.
Yeah, to add on that, I'll be brief, but we had one study in Ethiopia we'll talk about later, but we saw a lot of the infections in humans, the clinical infections and many of the incident infections, they were genetically very similar. While the chronic infections, they were very different, or they varied a lot. So that suggests that actually you have an endemic setting, and there seems to be some kind of outbreak suggestive indirectly of a super spreader event, that actually a lot of mosquitoes became infected with genetically the same clone. So I think knowing that information can really help us also where the research should go.
Thank you guys so much for spending that much time to explain this. Again, apologies for sometimes using the wrong terminology. We're going to jump towards some kind of a mix between AP and Ento. Here, as you know, both Sheila and myself are really entomologists, so whenever we find an opportunity, we want to skew towards that end. So Sheila, back to you.
Thank you, Fred. Yeah, so when thinking about how to measure transmission and probably assess the impact of the different interventions, vector control interventions, as well as other interventions, and looking at the levels of transmission. So when we are at the control phase and the elimination phase, which are some of the indicators? Just briefly talk to us about the indicators that we should be focusing on that would be sort of an accurate measure of what the impact of control interventions is. Let's start with probably the ENTO indicators, and then we can move on to the EPI indicators.
Yeah, I mean,
Please,
so,
yeah.
I could start, and I had the pleasure, and I think people will appreciate this just because of the times we're in. I did my first face-to-face teaching a week ago for our new intake of students at the London School here, and it was fantastic. And I talked a lot about how we measure transmission. And my point would be, well, there'd be 2 points. One, you need to define your question. So what question are you asking? And I think to your example there, Sheila, so let's start with the ENTO. How do you measure the control of the intervention? Well, if, for example, as Teun says, it's IRS, if you were to simply look at mosquito densities, irrespective of whether they were sporozoite rate or not, that would give you an indication of whether your IRS had worked. You wouldn't necessarily need to have an entomological inoculation rate assessment of that. It would be nice, but you wouldn't necessarily need to do that. I think the other thing related to the question, actually, Fredros raised it about RDT sensitivity and specificity, is my feeling is that at lower transmission, we actually need a combination of metrics to really reassure us that malaria is absent or even remains in a certain place. We can't just rely on, and it's to do with the sensitivity and specificity of any measure, but we can't simply rely on something because we know that it has, unless it's 100% sensitive, 100% specific, there's going to be a gap. And that's the same with every metric we've got. So you're trying to accumulate information from different metrics there. I mean, I am a huge fan of entomology, and Fredros, I hope you read my paper about EIR in Ificara. I remember doing that.
We have a question for you on that.
Great. But I think that the problem with it is, and it's again, it's not the discipline as such, it's just that you will know that actually there are surprisingly few mosquitoes with sporozoite rates, and generating a metric that allows you, so generating a sporozoite rate that allows you to calculate that EIR is not always possible, especially at lower transmission settings. And I think that is just the fundamental difficulty of it. I also think, again, this is your field, Sheila, Fredros, are the sampling methods adequate to capture sufficient mosquitoes? Are they representative enough? And I think that's a real sort of thing. We don't a standardized approach, and of course there shouldn't be. Teun mentioned Ethiopia. We've had, working with our colleague Fitzum, done some work on Stephen's eye. Now, you don't set a resting catch, or so you don't set, you can't do, say, a light trap. You have to go and search animal shelters for that to generate, So again, it's slightly vector dependent on that. I do think, again, broadly, it's about the sampling effort that you have to put in to generate your metrics for mozzies.
On the EPI side, it appears that the world has really gone around and accepted PFPR. For the two of you who work a lot on asymptomatic malaria, is this a problem for you? Or not? Oh.
I think I'm all for ways in which we can generate data, and PFPR is a good one. But I do think that if you were to draw that, say, simply using the conversion that Teun described in that last graph, that way around, you would see far more parasitism in an area than that simple PFPR by RDT or microscopy represents. That one, yes, exactly. If you were to draw PFPR based on that, it would be very different, Matt.
So for malaria elimination, and sorry for pushing you guys on this, but for people intending to do malaria elimination, would you recommend a different indicator that better captures this?
I think parasite prevalence in the end, I would like to at least argue against using gametocytes to inform your public health measures. It may sound counterintuitive, building your career on gametocytes and then saying it's not important. I think it's really relevant, but I don't think it's not the most relevant one from the epi-human metrics. I think knowing your parasite prevalence and how that changes, and knowing ideally also some idea of quantity that can be either by microscopy in combination with PCR or acute PCR. I think those are the measures that really inform you where you are in terms of tackling all infections and tackling recent infections.
And I do think you have to have an element of clinical cases there.
Of course,
but as we know that again that. We can say that, but we know, again, we've worked in health facilities where the approach to collecting that information, again, is not standardized. And part of that is human, part of that is in the person delivering, part of that is access to those facilities. And I do think actually density is a thing that's often not collected in the sense that it's just there and you have a yes or no prevalence, but density can, you would expect a shift from higher to lower densities as elimination was going down, and that can be a good indicator.
And then, of course, in the real end game, of course, it's a lot about clinical infections and screening around clinical infections, and really good surveillance, of course, is not only relevant for measuring malaria, but it's also crucial to actually tackle malaria.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, am I on mute? Sheila, do you think we should take one of the questions on the chat before we proceed?
Yeah, you can take the enter questions as I look for a question from the chat.
I don't have an enter question. I think a very quick brief question I had here for Teun and Chris is API, annual parasite incidents. I'm a bit embarrassed asking here, but how do we calculate this?
That's it. I mean, it's a good one. As far as my definition of it is the number of incident cases per 1,000 per year. I think that's my assessment, and of course that depends on a lot on how that information is collected.
All right. So Chris, you mentioned your work in Ifakara entomology. Again, a brief question here. For most of us doing EIR work, entomological inoculation rates, we catch mosquitoes. We get a bag of mosquitoes. We take a small sample. We take this to the lab, test them for Plasmodium, circumsporozoite protein, usually with ELISA. And then we use this fraction multiplied by biting rate and calculate EIR.
Yeah.
When you worked in Ifakara, you had an argument partially against this, but also mostly just to drive the point that the distribution of sporozoites in mosquito populations is not normal.
Yeah.
And that we have to take this into account. Now, my colleague Sheila, Lena Finda is on the call, and she has used this methodology recently to describe the situation in Ifakara, which has seen almost 99% reduction in transmission since your day. But we don't have someone who can explain this in the simplest terms possible, just to help our colleagues here improve on the way they calculate EIR. Can you explain this, please?
I will do my best, Fredros. But it was a lot of fun doing this, I have to say. I think there's two reasons. One, and I don't know, can you see that, my arrow? I've just tried to put, you see that now?
Yes, yes, you can see.
Okay, so you look at that, right? We caught 26,000 mosquitoes in one area. And what I can tell you furthermore about that, you may well have read the paper, but we caught 6,000 in one night in one trap, from one man who luckily was fast asleep for most of the night in one house, a single occupancy house. Now that was right next to a kind of a very, obviously very productive breeding site. The thought was that actually, well, there's no way that we can assay all those samples. So it was in one way, which is a practical approach to think of how do I estimate and how do I sample my mosquitoes for subsequent sporozoite ELISA. So there was a practical element to it. The second component was you tend to, with an EIR, you tend to simply present it with a figure. And, you know, like you say, I can move my arrow there, you know, you just that figure 114 it doesn't give you any idea of the variation. So part of our argument was, well, you can't do that because the two factors that comprise the EIR calculation are intrinsically linked. So one is a function of the other, and it actually makes the mathematics around calculating the EIR, or a confidence interval around the EIR, complicated. I think actually there are methods to do that now. So, but at the time, I think that there's a sort of broader message here, looking for sort of practical and simplistic approaches. We simply reduced the equation to the number of sporozoites caught in the number of traps. So remove that mosquito density element from the two components and combined them to allow us to calculate some 95% confidence intervals around those estimates. And that's all that we did.
Okay, is this something that you would recommend? So in practice, what this is, all the mosquitoes you catch, put them in pools, test them for sporozoite, and just divide by number of trap nights.
I think in that case, so as I said, that first, there was no way that we had the Reese's as time. I'd probably still be here doing those sporozoite ELISAs if I was going to do 26,000.
Yeah.
So there's no way we could do that, especially as actually it was done by a collaborator overseas, I think at that time in Ifakara. We didn't have the capacity then. The lab's much more developed now. So it was a way of trying to rationalize that. But I think that is a simple way. I think it's actually better if you can assay all the mosquitoes, whether you pool them or not. Those obviously in the cool and hot season on the left-hand side, that's something, those numbers are relatively manageable in terms of, you know, doing those ELISA. That's not very much work, he says, not doing very much lab work myself anymore. But it's something that is manageable. But yeah, I think you can reduce it and then simply generate an uncomplicated confidence interval that just allows you to put it a little bit more in perspective and perhaps do some more elaborate statistics about comparing EIRs then with now.
Thank you so much, Chris. Thanks a lot. Let's go back to our favorite story, Asymptomatic. Sheila, back to you.
Yeah, thank you, Fred. So now we have PCR, or we have more technical and well-developed tests, the PCR tests that are able to detect infections. And now we are actually seeing infections in older children. But before, when we were using slides, we tended to see that malaria infections were mostly in under 5s. Was this misdiagnosis, or is it really true that this is affected by age, that there is sort of a correlation between the age and infections?
I mean, age of infection and age and having an infection, or age and having severe consequences of the infection?
No, I mean like the shift now that we are seeing, since we have PCR, we are now seeing cases in older children above 5 years old. We even have a comment from Burkina Faso that malaria cases are more, or parasite densities are more between the ages of 5 and 12. And previously we thought that since we were using slides, we tended to detect cases in under 5s. So is it that that probably the blood slides were sort of misguiding us? that we always had infections even in older children?
I think we always had infections in older children. I think Larry Slutzker shared an interesting paper, just on a recent one, on severity in relation to parasite prevalence in the chat. So I think that that paper is a really nice paper that addresses some of the association with severity. If it just comes to infection, I think for a long time we know that actually immunity that prevents infections is either very incomplete or it's completely absent. And one of the most convincing studies I found was in Mali, where they started in the dry season, then they did regular PCRs and microscopy and clinical diagnosis, and they found that clinical diagnosis was mostly in under 5s, but if you look by PCR, incidence of infection was actually identical across all age groups. And I think when you say we now see many more infections in school children, actually many settings, again, depends on the epidemiology. We also see the higher density infections and the clonally complex infections, mostly in school children. But the severe consequences of disease, that's a different story. So that is still very much in the young age group.
So to what extent then do you think, so I mean, when we was, starting malaria studies, it was always the story that the most affected are children under 5 and pregnant women. At some point, epidemiologists start saying, we are seeing an age shift, malaria is moving to older kids. Of course, if you look at your data, that is not 100% true, but yes, it is partially true. The question for us is, has alluded to this already a lot, but to what extent was the messaging in the past really just a question of the available diagnostics then? Assume that we had PCR or we had whatever we're using now, wouldn't we be detecting as many infections in older kids as well? How has that driven this message that malaria is now shifted to older kids?
I think it's a combination of things. I mean, those, certainly around the time of doing that study, which you have on the screen, and again, it should still be a very strong component of the health approach, is that it's morbidity reduction, it's disease and disease reduction. So the focus on school kids would younger children, is because, they were sick and they were presenting. I think, as Teun said, we've always known that infections were there in the older age groups, that they just weren't presenting at clinics necessarily as much. What has happened is that, well, for two things, that study was done actually because of the shift towards ACTs, and ACTs being considerably more, so artemisinin combination therapies being considerably more expensive than the previous first line, and therefore control programs having to have a much better or to be more sure that a person had malaria. They couldn't just, as you said about yourself, Fredros, they couldn't just give you chloroquine.
Even chloroquine, it's more expensive.
It's far more expensive. So it's more about a rational delivery and cost-effective delivery of drugs. That's what delivered it. It's certainly the case that as transmission has gone down, and we should remember that it has gone down in many settings, there is that shift in prevalence to older age groups. I think that there's also a shift in mindset. When we first started out, we weren't really talking about elimination. We are now talking about elimination. We're talking about eradication. And I think that to have that conversation about elimination, you have to focus not just on the morbidity and the clinical surveillance and the reduction of clinical burden. You have to about the reduction in parasite burden. And that's really where we're coming from a non-medical sort of side, is saying, look.
But Chris, if you just take only our blood slide data, if you just take microscopy data only, if you just look at only microscopy data, you compare 1990 and 2020, would you see the age shift?
It depends where you're looking, Fredros. I think, I think you would. I think we are seeing less infections in kids. Certainly, again, Teun and I've worked in Burkina a lot over the last years, and really we're seeing infections in under 5s there significantly lower, as our colleague just pointed out about Burkina, because of SMC. I mean, those kids in the transmission season are getting that. So it's very difficult to do this agnostic of current interventions. Those kids are targeted with nets, they get SMC, and therefore they really have to have a lower prevalence. If they don't, then you're seriously worried that either the drugs and or the nets aren't working. So we have seen that shift, but it is kind of under looking at it against a backdrop of control. Ah, remember that one.
Too many references.
Yeah. You guys have published a lot, so it's we couldn't even cover 10% of your work. But anyway, Shayla, please.
Chris and Teun, this is just a general question on where are the gaps when we look at the malaria transmission, malaria life cycle within the human. Where are the gaps? What don't we know that we should actually be targeting? What are some of the questions that we should be asking ourselves and trying to answer?
I think there's at least one that we start to look at, which I think is still a big question. And I think a lot of things we have answered about how important are asymptomatics, how prevalent are they, how likely are they to infect mosquitoes. We answered. The one thing we have not yet answered, and it could be a very boring answer, it could be quite an exciting answer, is how much does the salivary gland load in mosquitoes matter for secondary infections? So in many infection systems, you would expect the higher the load, the more likely you have the next step. So if we're looking at the salivary glands, we know that a single oocyst gives 1,000, 2,000 sporozoites, sometimes a few hundreds, but enough to render a mosquito infectious for the remainder of her life. So we always assumed, and EIR is based on that, and we always assume that an infected mosquito is an infectious mosquito. And I think if that's not the case, and if oocyst burden, for instance, the infection burden in mosquitoes is really important, I think that could be a really important element. And that could also lead to a re-evaluation of a lot of the older work, including our own work. So I think that's one of the things that, if I also think about, you can't address everything. The one thing I would really like to add to scientific literature with my group, and with Chris probably, is there a bottleneck there, and how important is that for public health?
Yeah, and I think that is a really important question. I also think the other question about that is, and you raised it a little bit, Fedros, is about when that mosquito is biting, how frequently do mosquitoes probe? So if you have a relatively low sporozoite infected mosquito, but they probe 10 times on that person, compared to a mosquito with a high sporozoite load, who probes only once, is there equivalence in that? And I do think that mosquito behavior in that interaction with humans is really important to understand. What Teun's saying is right, and because it may mean that actually the more we go after these super spreaders, focus on trying to identify those, whoever they may be, we're going to have a more pronounced effect, because they're the ones generating these really high density mosquito infections. There's actually a question to come out, and I was going to read that, by Abdul Karim, just about the conversion of asexual to sexual. It would be very good to understand that in the different types of infections that we talked about, in these infections that are, it's something that I think is interesting, is that the time to patency from infection to infectiousness, how is that different in all of them? We know it's different between different mosquito species, different parasite species. Is it different in the different sort of infection sort of classes that we're talking about, these long infections that take ages to become clinical? Are they infectious before they become clinical? One would think so, if there is constant production of gametocytes. So I think that's an interesting question. I think we're getting the diagnostic tools and the molecular diagnostic. So they're not diagnostics in a sense, they're research tools. Yeah.
Would you say, I mean, back to what you guys are saying, and also what Teun said earlier, Teun, based on the comment you just made, does it mean that the way we currently identify malaria vectors is inaccurate? I mean, at the moment, we simply just check, do they have sporozoites in the salivary gland? And we incriminate the vector. And very rarely do we do infection studies. I mean, we just chop off the heads of mosquitoes and check if it's carrying any sporozoites. Are you suggesting that this is inaccurate?
I believe we really have to make sure that it's accurate. So for the time being, I think that it's still fair to assume that a mosquito with salivary gland sporozoites is an infectious mosquito. I'm pretty sure they are. But how much more infectious is a mosquito with 20,000 salivary glands sporozoites compared to one with 500? And if that's a big difference, it wouldn't change the way we assess EAR perhaps, but it does change the way we think about what is the factorial capacity, what is the human infectious reservoir. Perhaps these submicroscopic infections that many of them give rise to very low infected mosquitoes, perhaps they're slightly less important than we think, or perhaps we just got it spot on and they're as important. But I think it's just something that we need to know, and as soon as we know that, I think we can use modeling to just assume some of the distributions, and then probably all the data we have collected so far is appropriate.
Cool. And the questions you guys, the answers you guys have given up, Sheila, are these similar for PV and PVivax and PF? The gaps?
They're not, well, so for Vivax, it's, so again, I see some of my Ethiopian colleagues who joined us. Great. I think Vivax, of course, is very different in many ways. Of course, hypnozoites, but we'll not go there today. But
we could if you want.
No, let's not, because I'm looking at I'm just looking at how much I want to talk about. There's even more in my research interest. But gametocyte production is also faster in Vivax. So it means that clinical cases, actually, they're really, really infectious for Vivax as soon as they come to the clinic. For falciparum, often they're less infectious than asymptomatic cases. So then it's all, and I think that's the nice thing about malaria, you need to know many things. You can study one thing, but you really have to know how common are clinical cases and asymptomatic infections in a population. Then the big thing where we need also you guys like Fredros and Sheila and many on the call is mosquito exposure. A lot of our work is very interesting. We work with colony mosquitoes. We assume everyone gets bitten by a lot of mosquitoes, and we dissect these sometimes 60 mosquitoes a week later. We know in reality, of course, it differs, and not all of the mosquitoes will survive. So really getting all of that, and then including the likelihood that a mosquito that survives long enough also ejects sporozoites, is really work to be done.
Yeah, I mean, so, you know, falciparum gametocytes take 14 days to mature, and Vivax gametocytes have a 48-hour sort of cycle, that maturation period. So that, you know, and the adage is that you are infectious before you're sick with Vivax and after you're sick with falciparum. And of course, again, like nearly everything, there's a fairly broad distribution around that, but that's sort of how we tend to think about things.
Thank you guys so much. We have only half an hour to go, so we will try and move forward. Very few questions left. I think we're doing well with time. I see that you guys don't want to talk about hypnozoites.
Well, we can.
Maybe next time, you know, we can speak a little bit about hypnozoite biology. Teun, this is from your, I believe, also a paper you did with Chris, a very long review. I think it's microbiology or something.
Yeah.
And you have this nice demonstration of, you know, the rise in proportion with gametocytes and the decline in proportion with proportion gametocyte positive carriers and proportion of gametocyte among total population processed. Could you just explain a little bit?
Yeah, so, and I'm not sure whether I think all the data that we collected since then is fully supported.
Yeah,
Well, I
okay.
think some things have changed, but the idea there is you have a parasite load. Say you have 1,000 parasites per microliter.
Right.
And perhaps out of those, only 500 are gametocytes. So you have a certain fraction that is gametocyte, and often it's like 5% of the total parasite biomass that is gametocyte. But in some situations, actually, the parasite, either for a terminal investment, so the parasite feels that it's not going to survive in this host, it says, I need to go to the next host. And that could be immunity, or it could be drug pressure, or it could be old age. And then they start to invest more in gametocytes. So although parasite densities may decline, the proportion of those parasites that are gametocytes increases. So you see there's parasites, and we like to think of a parasite as quite a clever beast that really thinks about how am I going to survive, how am I going to propagate myself. They may change their gametocyte production depending on the conditions. And we've seen quite some evidence for that. And this is a depiction, this is a picture that explains that. So although parasite prevalence declines with age, and even the proportion of people who have gametocytes may decline with age, the proportion of parasites that is gametocyte may actually increase. So this is, in a way, it's a warning that even if you have low density infections, these infections may actually really prepare for the next host. And there are some
you guys have evidence for this with the Tom Chacha, right?
Yeah, for Tom Chacha and from Senegal.
Burkina, I think we have
also in Senegal there was an interesting paper.
Is that it?
Ah, that's the one. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think this is one that I think it is a great paper. It still has a few unknowns as what's the power of modeling, that you can model some things without knowing all of the steps. I think Chris and I both like to know every step and measure every step. So I think one of the things that could happen here is that if transmission goes down, the remaining parasites become more efficient in spreading. It's a parasite factor. Another thing could be, and we'll not talk about that, I think, but gametocyte immunity can also reduce the likelihood that a gametocyte results in an infected mosquito. And perhaps that immunity also declines when transmission declines. And then as a consequence, transmission efficiency goes up.
Thank you. Sheila, you had a question about that. You're muted, Sheila.
Oh, yeah. So there's a question in the chat whether there is a threshold of sporozoites that causes diseases. Do we know that? Is there evidence for this?
I think that, again, it's so multifactorial. So it depends. If you're just assuming what's inoculated, there are then a number of sort of ways in which that if you inoculate 10 sporozoites or 100 sporozoites, there is a possibility that some of them will get, taken up by the immune system and, or not reach the liver for whatever reason. Again, actually, Tom Chacha has done some work with, in the context of CHMI, the controlled human malaria infections, where they can show a significant increase in probability with the likelihood of infection from 5 mosquito bites to a human in that.
I believe that's studies. The paper is that the paper you're talking about? No?
I don't think it's that one, is it? No.
Okay, cool. Go ahead.
No, but it's a probability. It's simply the more sporozoites there are, the more likely to have. But there's no sort of threshold. In theory, one successful will lead to an, if it gets to the liver, then it could lead to a sort of blood stage infection.
Yeah, thank you. Teun, you mentioned gametocyte immunity, and I think there's a paper that you wrote. I think we might have included it, but probably at the end, two-phase immunity. Could you talk to us about this specific paper?
Yeah, so that's immunity, of course, the immunity we typically think of is the immunity that prevents you from either getting infected, doesn't work very well with malaria, or prevents you from developing severe malaria, saves a lot of lives. I mean, that's, of course, it is rapidly acquired and it is well studied. And the type of immunity Chris and I are also interested in is the immunity against gametocytes. So gametocytes are inside red blood cells. But there are proteins on the surface of gametocytes that are needed when gametocytes enter the next host, mosquitoes, and the male and female gametocytes, they activate and they fertilize and they ultimately render the mosquito infectious. And this immunity, we know very well that we can have natural antibodies that interfere with parasite development in mosquitoes. That's what we call transmission reducing immunity. And one of the outstanding questions, and it's still unknown whether it exists, is whether there's also transmission enhancing immunity. For Plasmodium vivax, there's quite convincing data that if you have very low antibody densities, you may actually enhance transmission, which, to be honest, I hope doesn't exist for Plasmodium falciparum, because if that's the case, then we would have a transmission blocking vaccine that has a long tail end. So then for a long time you prevent transmission, but then for an even longer time you have these low densities, and that may actually stimulate the transmission that's still possible, which I think would be a bit of a nightmare scenario from a vaccine deployment scenario. So I think it's something that's speculative at the moment. There's some indications. I'm not convinced it exists, this transmission enhancing immunity, especially not for falciparum. But it's something that if we have time, or someone here on the call says, I would love to work on that, we're happy to discuss it with you.
Very much. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Fred, back to you. You're muted.
Thank you very much. I don't know, do you guys have any interest to speak about the Horn of Africa a little bit? Would you mind?
We can try.
You've been mentioning Ethiopia several times. All right. So something seems to be happening, or a number of things are happening in the Horn of Africa. And, you know, while preparing for the masterclass, you start to see some kind of a confluence. We have, on one hand, from mosquito biologists' point of view, this Anopheles stephensi situation, with a lot of transmission for P. vivax. And then you have perhaps the most affected area in Africa with the HRP2 deletion in the same region. And monitoring your publications, you guys have a very active piece of work there, using as high as 50% of the PF infections there being sub-patent. Now, you know, the other thing we notice is that it's probably only your group that kind of studies all these things together, except we haven't seen a lot of your studies on HRP2 deletions, but we talked with Tadesse, a fantastic young man, really great. But he gave us a masterclass on Anopheles stephensi together with other colleagues. And it seems that you guys are interested in this entire area. Talk to us a little bit about the combined threat of these things happening in the Horn of Africa and how the rest of Africa should prepare. HRP2 deletions, Anopheles stephensi, sub-patent infections at very high levels, and maybe, just maybe there will be some artesunate resistance there too. We don't know. But talk to us about that, either of you, please. Hopefully this is a relevant question.
No, it's a relevant question, because I think Ethiopia, a lot of things, of course, go extremely well in malaria control, but Ethiopia, as you clearly explained, also exemplifies some of the real worries. And we are working with a great team of malaria researchers at ARI, also with other institutions, but primarily at ARI, led by Fitz and Tadesse. And the work, well, we've done some work on stephensi. It's clearly a very competent factor for local falciparum and local vivax. And the big worry would be that stephensi is really spreading into the area where there's a lot of malaria. So it can really, at the moment, I think every report you see, it spread further. So probably this, as soon as we talk about it, it's outdated. But at the moment, some of the most heavily affected areas in Ethiopia are not the same areas that the areas where Stevens Eye has really established itself. But that's one of the things that is a real worry. And then if you combine that with undetectable infections, then you can really imagine a perfect storm. So this is something that we also feel is probably not the topic where you want to focus on your academic career, but you really have to advocate some action. And at ARI, they're really coming up with a plan for containment and pilot elimination programs, because I think there's a lot of science to be done. But it would feel terrible if we write fantastic papers about a catastrophe that's slowly happening or rapidly happening in a way in Ethiopia. Those are my few words about the Horn of Africa.
Yeah, I mean, Teun, you're right. I did actually see Stevens Eye being described in Sudan in emerging infectious diseases last month, I think. And they're absolutely right. I think that what we're seeing is, and this is relevant, is that Ethiopia, well, and Djibouti, certainly those areas on the fringe of the Horn, transmission levels are really low. And what that tends to mean is that complexity of infection will be comparatively low. And therefore, you are selecting for those HRP2 resistant infections. If complexity of infection is quite high, HRP2 deletions may appear, but the infection will be detected because they'll be mixed in with others that are HRP complete. It's when that transmission drops and they are increasingly found alone that they will. And it's kind of natural selection in the sense that they're not being detected. So it's not that they're resistant in any way, they're just not being picked up, and they will permit themselves. And I do think that is something we've got to sort of work on. And I think we've seen it, and I think this is a fantastic thing from the WHO, making surveillance a pillar of control and thinking about long-term investment in surveillance. And you will have seen this from the entomological side. Whilst all those metrics, thinking about EIR and so forth, simple species composition, changes in species composition over time from a set of standardized catches, and ideally including perhaps some more urban areas now, is one thing. Understanding the rise of, we want to see HRP2 deletions at a very low level. It's when they're actually in that very slight rise that that's when we have to really try and catch it. And that precipitates the need for alternative diagnostics. So I think that, LDH based diagnostics are actually going to be, available in the next few years. I think that increasingly so. But we do have to have that longitudinal surveillance to allow us to do that. And just remembering, I think in Fitsum's paper, just showing how those Stevens Eye appeared to have moved along the main truck routes from, Djibouti into Ethiopia, and just understanding just how connected we all are these days. I mean, we're not isolated little bubbles of transmission anymore. Mosquitoes will hitch rides pretty easily in trucks and things.
Yeah, it's just very interesting, or not interesting is not the right word, but kind of scary that in this same location you have these challenges arising at the same time. You have HRP2 deletions, you have Stevens Eye. This is also the area where you have a lot of vivax in Africa. So because the rest of Africa doesn't have P. vivax that much. So yeah, it's a subject that Shell and myself hope that we will have a conversation more about in the future. And I know that, Chris, you guys wrote a small note on this in the Tropical Medicine Journal recently with your colleagues on how you would address this HRP2. So it's nice to be speaking to you about that. But I want to hand this back to Fela, as we have only 19 minutes to go, 17 minutes to go. Shela, please.
Yeah, back to human infectiousness. So we have currently two methods that I know of, direct feeding or direct feeding, and then we have membrane feeding, where mosquitoes are fed on blood that has been put in membrane feeders. Chris, could you talk to us a little bit about the differences between these two methods and what the impact is, or how we can be using this data? What the implications of the results would be?
Yeah, I mean, it's actually quite a simple difference. I could definitely take this one. Teun's already actually said what the kind of result is, but in the graphic on the left of my screen, a direct feeding assay is what it says. So we allow mosquitoes to feed directly on the human arm, and then keep the blood-fed ones and dissect the midguts for oocysts later, or even keep them for even longer and look for sporozoites. And the direct membrane feeding assay is taking the blood and putting it into an artificially pre-warmed feeder with a membrane which the mosquitoes come and probe through. The difference, the advantage of, well, okay, there's pros and cons to both. The direct feeding assay is, of course, what in theory happens in real life. Disadvantages are you don't really like to do it on young children. It is uncomfortable. There's not really many ways to get around it. In adults, it's become increasingly acceptable to do this, but you can't really use large numbers again. And you want to be sure that your mosquito colonies are very clean and free from viruses. And so the potential to use, say, a wild caught or a more representative wild population is, I would suggest, limited. For the membrane aspect, by simply putting it into an artificial system, you can obviously manipulate the blood before you put it into the system. So as Teun was describing the immunity, one of the ways we do that is from that blood, we can remove the person's plasma and put a test plasma, which might contain a drug or a monoclonal antibody, or be somebody from a non-exposed area, and compare the outcomes. There's a little bit more manipulation that's possible there, but it does have a potential to, you know, it has a scientific manipulation.
Yeah, what are some of the factors that would influence the success of this should I call them tests?
Yeah, assays.
Yeah.
I mean, we've done so much on this. I would say that the key thing, at least for the second, is the time from taking your blood to putting it into the mosquito feeder. And I'm actually going out to the Gambia with a thermos flask, because we did some experiments to show you can keep blood in thermos and transfer it to the insectary from facilities that are a bit further away. Teun, you may have a bit more to say on that.
Well, I think the other thing that is anticoagulants, they probably matter. So I think one of the differences between skin feeding and membrane feeding is also membrane feeding. You typically use heparin, and that may reduce infectivity a little bit. I think temperature is a real important thing. And of course, with direct skin feeding, there's little you can do wrong, because the subject or the human will keep the blood at the right temperature. I think the other thing, and that's an eternal struggle with these types of experiments, is your mosquito colony has to be receptive. And we have experienced problems in the past, and I think many people experience this, where you see pathogens other than malaria sneaking into your colony. And it can either be by overfeeding mosquitoes, or it can just be some environmental factor you have little influence on. But often they do affect transmission. So I think in terms of getting the experiment going and trusting your results, having a susceptible colony is the first step, and it's not trivial.
Teun, that's interesting, trusting your results. So are they representative of what is actually happening in the field?
So I saw you showed a slide. So I just tell you one study of myself that I don't trust too much myself anymore. You had this slide from eLife with Tom Churcher. You saw it on the slides. I saw it on the slide somewhere.
One more.
No, this one. So here we try to relate gametocyte density to mosquito infection rate. If you look at the top left graph, and we saw this interesting plateau that was a long stretch where gametocyte density, it could increase, but it didn't really result in increased mosquito infection rate. I don't believe this is true, actually. I think this.
Not anymore.
I think science is progressing, and sometimes you also have to say probably we didn't use the right assays. There may have been some RNA degradation there. We have a follow-up paper, and it's one of the things I like about eLife, that you can just say, we've done this, but actually now we have better results. If you have better gametocyte quantification, it's a lot more predictive, the association. And that does seem to be like an inflection point, probably below 1 gametocyte per microliter, no way you're going to infect a mosquito, or very, very, very unlikely. If you reach 10 or even 100, then it really goes up, and it's really, and there's a lot of noise, but it's quite a smooth line up. So I think this data I would not cite anymore as the association between gametocyte density and mosquito infection rates.
Yeah, thank you. Back to you, Fred.
Thank you so much, guys, for taking time to explain this. Very quickly, on the last few questions, you guys already talked about this a lot. I know you said there are some variations, but broadly, is this statement correct?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So
Next
that's
one.
good for our clarifications. Bruno Moon and our friends and you guys have developed this thing. Also, of course, very similar to the ears of the hippopotamus agenda. So unless if there's any new thing that we need to say here, the only question we have here is that when resources are limited, how much should countries focus on identifying these submicroscopics?
Yeah, Fredros, I think that is actually the key question for our control partners. I think that we have a lot of ideas, and one thing we haven't talked about is kind of drugs and, you know, how they might affect transmission, and we've done a lot of work on that, and we were very early sort of promoters of a sort of, say, mass drug administration. But we kind of now, seeing the data and seeing those people that have attempted those kind of things, they're really complicated to deliver. It's complicated to do at scale. You need good coverage, and you need longevity and commitment to these kind of things. And I do think that the main sort of idea is thinking around, you know, we've got to keep morbidity down. And I think that that is okay. However, I think there was something in, I think in one of your earlier sort of slides, question about, say, school children. We talked a little bit about them, but perhaps we're not thinking about, if we want to hasten the progress towards elimination, we do have to start thinking about tackling this reservoir of asymptomatic infections. And so I think it's let's go to
that now that you mention it. I'm going to throw this back to Sheila. It's nice that you mentioned that. Sheila, please.
Sorry, Fred.
The school, you asked about the school.
Oh yeah.
So this is a question that we like asking about how best to target school children, school-going children. What are some of the interventions that we should be putting in place, especially with the data that we are seeing now? The under 5s,
such as this data that you have from Uganda, which this is your recent study from Uganda.
Yeah.
Should we be targeting them, and with which interventions?
Yes, I think this large contribution here in this setting, most infected mosquitoes came from school children, or found their source in school children. It may differ a bit, but I'm convinced that in all settings we've looked at, school children are really important transmitters. And in part because they're underserved with the common interventions. So it doesn't even need a funky monoclonal antibody. Just make sure that they use their nets. And Chris, you have co-led school-based intervention in Kenya.
Yeah, well, Uganda, that one. We did a little bit in Kenya. I think the other thing is there's so much broader ramifications. You know, those kids, look how fantastic they look on your screen. They're smart, they're receptive, they're the future, they're us in, 10, 15 years. They're sponges for information. So I think, as targets for interventions, we should be thinking about their sort of intellectual increasing awareness, because if even is part of the message they get home and say, Mum, I need to sleep under that mosquito net or else I'll transmit malaria to somebody, that's fantastic. I also think it's kind of in the bottom line there. We have young girls in those schools who we know are at risk of malaria in pregnancy, or malaria in pregnancy is, again, a major source of morbidity. Targeting those young girls, it always seems to me that we see them when they arrive at clinics in their first ANC visit and they're already infected. And that seems to me we've, shut the door after the horse has already bolted, to use an English phrase. Could we target those? I think that the difficulty is, you've got a mixture of health, of the Department of Education, Department of Health. How do we deliver? What we did in Uganda was we gave monthly DP to school kids, and the effect was borderline significant on reduction of parasite prevalence in the community. And I think I know the reason for that was because we could not get coverage because of more logistical issues, not because the intervention didn't work.
In some studies from West Africa, we spoke to Abdullahi Jim, they report quite a lot of reduction with the IPTI. Is that something you would recommend for?
Do you mean SMC going up an age range?
It is. So yeah, so I mean, SMC is very much the same thing, except,
Yeah.
MDA, SMC is very much MDA. I mean, I might be wrong here, but
yeah,
multiple times. So yeah,
it's giving trust. I think the challenge with schools, and we've had this with Burkina actually, is that actually in malaria transmission, and this, kids are not in school when it's raining because they're helping people in the fields and doing some work. So there may be inopportune delivery times, and that's common in certain countries in West Africa. Increasing SMC from 5 to 10 years is another way of targeting to that particular age group at that particular time when infection is most prevalent and transmission is highest, I think, is another way. So that school, you're targeting a demographic group there. You're not necessarily targeting through schools. You'd have to do that a different way, I think.
You're right, Pedros, that the SMC is, of course, an extraordinarily effective intervention, and I think you can adopt it or improve on it by increasing the age range to really capture those individuals who also contribute a lot to transmission, and perhaps even optimizing the treatment strategies to really limit transmission. And then I think it can also be quite a potent approach to reduce transmission and save a lot of lives at the same time. So I think it could really be even more powerful than it already is.
Yeah.
It's unfortunate that. Go ahead, Sheila.
No, just after you're done, there are some questions in the chat about MDA and immunity. I wanted us to cover those after you're done. You're muted, Fred.
I almost
saying, unfortunately, because of time, we were not able to cover the treatment side. But I just wanted to show you here that, we were hoping that we would talk a little bit about treatment options, but I think we'll have to scale this for the next masterclass. But you did mention SMC, and there are questions about MSAT, MDA. We're going to ask you a very broad question about that. But first of all, talk to us a little bit about what happens to gametocytemia when you introduce treatment. So we found one study from you guys where it appears that, I don't know if this is the right study, whether if you treat people, it kind of changes gametocytemia. Is that right? That when people are on treatment. Yeah, can you talk about this?
I think so.
Does this mean then transmission increases because you treat people?
I think that overall you will, and this will be one of my last sentences, I'm sorry, but because I have to run, but overall, as soon as you get rid of the asexual parasites, you get rid of the source of gametocytes.
Right.
And that's important to realize. So even if you have a transient increase in gametocyte density, getting rid of infections is always a good thing. Now, the faster you get rid of these gametocytes, the better for transmission. But any efficacious drug, even if it doesn't have an immediate effect on gametocytes, will be in a way a transmission reducing drug. If you add primaquine, if you add methylene blue, but primaquine is the most logical choice, you will accelerate that gametocyte clearance.
It's all about that area under the curve of transmission. So even remembering that gametocytes come from asexual parasites. If you clear those, there can't be any more.
Yeah, and I know Teun said he has to leave. This is our last question. You're talking area under cover. I mean, you guys did this work together, right? So what happens then if you don't treat them?
Yeah, I think this is the other thing. We often, and we have fantastic treatment studies ongoing in Mali, and we like, it's all directly observed treatment. I think many here on the call will know that 6 doses of artemether-lumefantrine will not always result in 6 tablets swallowed. And those things will really matter in the end, in really knowing what does it do to resistance, of course, but also what's the real impact on clearing infections, because we do see that if you don't clear infections completely, they're very likely to come back with high densities of the nucleotides. And that is also one of the messages of this story. If you don't treat completely, you do see that you get transmissible infections within a month.
Thank you so much. Sheila, what do you think? Shall we let Teun go, or shall we ask him to give his final words?
Yeah, please, Teun, your final words.
Well, my final words would just be, I think this is a fantastic initiative. Talking to 120 to 180 people for so long. Congratulations on doing this. I think we should keep doing this also for the planet, because this is a carbon neutral way of exchanging thoughts. And I think this is something that cannot replace in-person meetings, but it's something we really have to embrace to supplement and replace some of the in-person meetings. So well done. I really enjoyed.
Thank you.
And I would say exactly the same. It's been a thrill. I mean, there's so many, I want to talk to everybody who's put something in the chat. And so thank you, Fredros and Sheila, for setting it up and for inviting everybody.
Thank you guys so much for your kind words. And as you noticed, we have always more questions than we have time for.
That's life. That's good. That's good.
But I think part of it is also just the breadth of work that you guys have done in this field is incredible. And as Sheila and myself said earlier, we are very, very grateful to you guys for paying attention to this field that was otherwise so widely neglected for so many years. It will reach a time when, when people go towards elimination, they cannot afford to not pay attention to the undetectable, so-called.
Yeah.
Fortunately, diagnostics are improving, so hopefully this is going to be good. Again, to our audience and colleagues joining on the call, thank you so much for your company, for the questions. Thanks to all the other experts joining in as well. We will send out an announcement for the next masterclass as soon as we have confirmations from Nick White and team. Otherwise, send this back to my incredible co-host, Sheila, for her last words as well, and then we will close. Sheila, please.
Yeah, so mine is a big thank you to our speakers today, Chris and Teun. This was quite enlightening. We have learned a lot. I have learned a lot. So a big thank you for sharing all the knowledge that you have today. And it was such an interesting masterclass and well attended. We thank you for sparing the time to talk to us today. And we had lots of questions in the chat box. I'm sure we will get those directly to you once we compile the report. And then we can probably respond to those directly to those who asked the question. So thank you again to all of us who attended today. And we hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.
Asante, merci beaucoup.
Thank you so much, and do have a wonderful weekend, and look forward to the next class. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.